Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and depending on the time zone that you're visiting from at this moment. I'm Terry Humphreys. I'm from Canada. I'm going to be your moderator as well as one of the speakers today. And I am joined by my esteemed colleagues from around the world. And we make up basically the scientific committee's chairs. So I'm one of the vice chairs. I'm going to introduce Erick Janssen. Erick, do you want to just say hi? He is the chair of the scientific committee.
Hello.
And I'll introduce Kristen Mark, who is another vice chair of the scientific committee.
Hi, everyone.
Great. And I'm very happy again to welcome all of you to this webinar, the importance of sexual science for WAS and us in general, and thank you for sharing your precious time with us. WAS is hosting a number of these free webinars to help promote our 26th World Association for Sexual Health Congress that is being held in Antalya, Turkey, November 2nd through the 5th of this coming year, this year, sorry. And as many of you are aware, the main aim of WAS is to promote sexual health and rights for all across the lifespan. WAS is a global organization that aims to promote sexual health and rights through education, research, clinical practice, services. And the upcoming theme of our Congress is bridging the gaps: sexual health, sexual rights, sexual justice, and sexual pleasure for all. Many of these are unmet needs around the world, so it's very timely for us and a very lofty goal for us to strive for. And the WAS Scientific Committee, along with the broader WAS organization and in association with the host organization in Turkey, which is the Turkish Association for Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies, are looking to deliver a high-quality scientific program in sexual science, education, and clinical practice. And we are very privileged to be partnered with our local host in Turkey. Mehmet Sengur, who is taking the lead there as our host, has referred to this Congress venue as, in Antalya, as the Turkish Riviera. So Antalya is located on the Mediterranean Sea, and it is very important to note that the venue is actually an all-inclusive hotel. So please make the most of your stay. And if you get a chance, take a look at the surroundings around it as well. It's beautiful area, historic landmarks, ancient cities. So that's a little about the Congress that's coming, the WAS Congress that's coming up in Antalya. But I'd also like to orient you a little bit to our viewership out here to the WAS Scientific Committee itself, what we do. The main role of the Scientific Committee, among others, is to plan and organize the WAS Congress every 2 years to bring together this cutting-edge research, education, and clinical practice, to invite broadly perspectives from around the world, and to inform progress towards sexual health and sexual rights. The Congress invites abstracts in a range of different formats, from symposia to oral and poster presentations, debates, demonstrations, workshops, and roundtables. So part of the role of the scientific committee then is to evaluate the scientific rigor and the merit of those abstracts that are submitted to the Congress, which is why we thought a webinar on the importance of science would be a fitting topic for one of our webinars. So without further ado, I'm obviously joined by my esteemed colleagues right now, but I'm going to let them talk about, as this free symposium is referred to as, musings about the sexual science, the state of the art that we're currently in. And we will start off with Erick Janssen, who is a very important big shot researcher in Belgium, world renowned. He actually told me to say all of those things. And then we'll move on to Kristen Mark, who is an endowed chair in the University of Minnesota in sexual health education. And then I will have my little blurb to say as well, my musings on sexual science and then we will move to a Q&A with the audience. So we will take the Q&A, so make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we will get to as many of those as we can. So without further ado, I am going to hand this over to Dr. Erick Janssen.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Terry. I don't want to spend too much time on introductions. I'm very happy to see you all here. And when thinking about today's topic, I prefer to focus on the very basics, the basic science, and why we care about basic science. I'll share the screen with you. This is my little title, From Mice to MRIs, because it rhymes. Why basic sex research matters, and in general, to all of us, people who may or may not be involved in sex research themselves. You think, well, for me, it's pretty obvious why sex research matters. But there are, as we probably all are aware of, a lot of people in the world who think differently about the role and the importance of science in general. According to quite a few people, science actually doesn't matter. I love this little image of the Flat Earth Society apparently on their own website and in their own social media. They say they have members all around the globe, which is interesting considering the globe obviously is not flat. So, why would we care about research and science versus values and opinions? We are working in an area where values and opinions are very present. Sexuality, sexual health is a very value-laden field. And it's exactly because of that the role of science and research only are more important, I think. Another example, in contrast to the flat Earth, a bit closer to home when it comes to sex and sexuality, there have been two commissions on pornography in the US over the years. One very long ago that actually funded a lot of research on pornography. It was federal money for 80 or so studies. And that the conclusion of that report was that there was not much evidence that porn would lead to sexual aggression, sexual violence. Well, Nixon and his staff and others were not happy with those conclusions. So there was a follow-up commission on pornography in 1986. And this is from the report. The establishment of a link between porn use and sexual violence requires assumptions that are not found exclusively in the experimental evidence. We see no reason, however, not to make these assumptions that are plainly justified by our own common sense. This is a US government report, over 2,000 pages, where data were not included because it was all about opinions. So why does it matter, basic sex research? Well, obviously, we're talking about questions like, what is this? What is this thing we're talking about? Desire, sexual function, gender. How does it work? What are the mechanisms? What are processes related to it? Are there things we can do to change it? Do we want to change it? How does that work? Basic questions. And the WAS, of course, mission is larger. We focus on issues about sexual rights. We promote and advocate for sexual health and sexual rights throughout the lifespan across the world. But science has a role in this because it does this by advancing sexology, science-based sexuality knowledge, research, comprehensive sex education, clinical care, and services. We're talking about scientifically based, scientifically informed by the best evidence, sex education and clinical psychology, for example. Science, this is actually a quote from a Scientific American article. Science is a process of learning and discovery. And sometimes we learn that what we thought was right is wrong. Science is a process. Science is not as objective as people sometimes learn in methods classes, etc. Science is human work and with its problems and its limitations, but it is, scientific approaches and methods are, the best we have to offer. at least if you, as I do, believe that opinions and values have the most weight and impact, if they're supported by or at least consistent with the best available evidence. And for the science geeks among you, if they're not refuted in a more proper type of approach. I love this quote from Carl Sagan, science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. Now, let's see. So I want to give a few examples of how I think basic science has contributed to and continues to contribute to our understanding of sexuality, and with really real-life implications. Even when you think of sexual anatomy, you know, Leonardo da Vinci was one of the first, of course, to very systematically observe the body, actually, by cutting it open. And came to conclusions about our body. He was the first to really show how the spine works, etc. Obviously, he was also one of the first to make some mistakes and to have not everything right. But it is, again, a process. If you jump ahead, because he already dissected the male penis, but it took many, many years, as we all know, to really understand the anatomy of the clitoris. This work by Helen O'Connell was instrumental in changing what we thought was all part of the clitoris. She did very basic scientific research that had, where she challenged, on the basis of her observations, common ideas about parts of what we now consider part of the clitoris, and in all modern textbooks they are referred to as the bulbs of the vestibule, which she, on the basis of her own analyses, concluded are actually part of the clitoris itself. So we often see images like this these days, and it's very basic research, but it is research that empowers, because it tells us about how our bodies work and what is all included. And it has relevance even in terms of, I don't know, I jumped ahead, sexual pleasure, and focus and redirection more or less of our attention to parts of our genital anatomy that actually are really important and contribute to things like pleasure. And of course, they showed these findings that certain things really were wrong. Freud's vaginal orgasms versus how the world really works. Most likely, vaginal orgasms involve the clitoris, the internal parts of the clitoris, the G-spot, which has never really been found in terms of true strong evidence for an anatomical specific system, may very well just also reflect sensitivity of the clitoris. Of course, Masters and Janssen, I have to mention them, they contributed enormously to our understanding of the physiology of sex. They also had some things wrong, and we can criticize in various ways sort of the conclusions that they arrived at in terms of sort of models of what is normal sexual response, the role of orgasm. But we learned a lot thanks to them about the physiology, about ballooning effects in the vagina, the uplifting of the uterus, basic knowledge that has to a large degree been replicated later in some MRI studies, and some parts of it have not. I want to give another example of sexual psychophysiology as a basic method and approach in which both genital responses are measured, and people can also indicate how they feel. And what this type of research has revealed is that the connection between what happens in our genitals in terms of arousal and how we feel is often weak. And that has enormous implications at a very basic level. It challenges ideas about what exactly is sexual arousal. If is a genital response enough to call someone sexually aroused? Is a subjective response, feelings of sexual arousal enough? But what we've learned from it is that we cannot really consider genital response is a sufficient condition for sexual arousal, or for something that or as something that indicates desire, wanting, or consent. There have been cases, rape cases, where women in particular have been told that because they were wet, because they showed physiological signs of arousal, they must have been aroused. It's basic methodology, basic science like this that challenges those kind of conclusions with real life implications. Another example, quick one that I want to give, the dual control model of sexual response, which I've worked on for many, many years, is being applied. I'm not going into the details of the model, but it involves the role of sexual excitation inhibition and the balance between those types of processes in sexual arousal and its regulation, you might say. And that is being applied in all kinds of areas of research, but also clinically. I hear from sex therapists and others that they talk with couples and people, individuals about, what is interfering with your sexual experiences, your sexual pleasure? Is it a lack of stimulation, of getting the right types of stimuli? Or is it maybe that something else is going on and you're getting the right type of stimulation, but there is a suppression of your sexual response? Well, so that's a model, I consider it a model that is pretty well applied both in research and clinically. But what the point I want to make is that it actually was inspired by very basic studies of physiological studies on sexual response, cognitive studies, physiological studies. And in discussing the findings in their work, together with John Bancroft, the two of us tried to make sense of all those findings of very basic research, and the dual control model emerged from those conversations. How about those mice and the MRI? I'm not going to go into that too much. There's obviously a strong role for animal models, but also with limitations. The mice you see here are actually from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and they actually rule the world, but that's a different topic. But prairie voles are a beautiful example of very basic research that has taught us a lot, and that also has proved relevance to us. The discovery of oxytocin and the role of oxytocin in pair bonding is a great example. It's one of the Sue Carter you see here with a little prairie vole in her hand. This has set off new research, and now also increasingly we know of studies on, for example, oxytocin in humans. I'm running low on time. Basic sex research should matter to all of us, and for clinicians, there's so many reasons, so many things I could say about it. But even when you look at the DSM-5, which is of course very important and influential in our clinical application and work, but the DSM-5 is based on research. There have been proposals to do things differently, to change categories, and those changes have not been followed through because of there not being enough of a scientific basis for them, according to various committees. So what that means is, the DSM, there are all kinds of things that we could say about that, but it is an important document and it reflects current scientific insights. And if you think things should be different, then you need to do and help us do the research so those changes can come in the future. Of course, there are lots of questions. How do we best help young people who would like to make their bodies and lives more congruent with a sense of self and their gender? We can do that on the basis of values, opinions, or we can try and use the best science possible to explore those questions. Same for educators. Why is it important? Well, when we talk about educating our children, what do 5, 10, or 15-year-old children need to know? What do they understand? Where are they developmentally? How do we communicate with them? Sorry, it automatically keeps jumping. Those things we cannot just base on our ideas and opinions. We need systematic research on very basic processes before we can really make a lot of advances. and policymakers. Of course, an example of this was published in March, WHO policy on preventing and addressing sexual misconduct. Without an understanding of human behavior, the determinants of certain behaviors, we will not make much progress with that, I think. So science matters, basic science included, and that's all I want to sort of focus on.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Eric. That is a lot to process, and certainly reemphasizes the need for basic science, I think, in the field. It demonstrates how far we've come. Let me switch now to my fellow vice chair of the scientific committee, Kristen Mark, who will progress and maybe talk a little bit more about sex science in context.
Yes, thank you so much. So really happy to be here to talk about sex science generally. In fact, as a PhD student, I actually trained in sex science with Dr. Erick Janssen at the Kinsey Institute. And I've also known Dr. Terry Humphreys since even before that, when I was a master's student up in Canada. So I've been reading, processing, citing, conducting, and collaborating with these two for almost 20 years. Did you all realize that? 20 years ago. Since 2006. So that is a long time. And I think, I loved that summary that you provided, Dr. Janssen, about just how things can grow and change, and how there's, it's okay to come back to the research that was maybe foundational and point out the issues with it, while also acknowledging what we have taken away from that and how valuable that was. And I think that now more than ever, that is quite important for us to remember. So I'm Kristen Mark. I'm on the WAS Advisory Committee, Vice Chair of the Scientific Committee, and I'm also a professor at the University of Minnesota's Medical School in the Eli Coleman Institute for Sexual and Gender Health. And I'm going to talk about some of my research using that as an example for why it's important to keep sex science in context, in context in a lot of different ways. And so there are a lot of reasons why context might matter, right? Sex doesn't happen in a vacuum. And even if you are engaging in solo sexual behavior, there's still a context within which that solo sexual behavior is taking place, right? Are you afraid of a roommate hearing you? Are you afraid of, are you turned on by a roommate hearing you? There's all these different components of even solo sex and engaging in masturbation where that context is important. And then you move on to relationships and the ways in which different relationships might result in different sexual response patterns. It might result in different ways in which you feel comfortable or safe, or something that I think Terry will talk about after I'm done, is the role of the context of consent and how that can factor into why this context really matters. And so there are a few different ways that we as sexual scientists can consider context, and that's really what I'm going to focus most of today on. But in the question and answer section, I look forward to us diving maybe a little deeper into what you're most interested in related to context. So let's start with relationships. One of the ways that we can think about and contextualize relationships is as a network. Sometimes your relationship is just between you and maybe one romantic partner. But that old sex ed adage that is very harmful and problematic of, if you have sex with one person, you've had sex with everyone they've had sex with. We can measure that with sex science, actually, and we can test whether or not that is true. It's not in a lot of ways, and certainly not in the shame-based way that message is sometimes delivered. But those relationships can really matter. They can matter for things like tracking STI transmission rates. They can matter for that mapping of being able to map unprotected sex partners, or being able to map transmission rates of STIs or HIV. And we do that through something called network analysis. And this is a very basic diagram of a network analysis, but you can see how the relationships between these people, if you think about each of those dots as people, how the relationships between them can be assessed and measured and systematically tested for the links between how these interact with each other. And with tools like network analysis, we can do multiple relationships for anything from testing HIV or to STIs, all the way to things like pleasure mapping, and being able to look at, let's say, a network of consensually non-monogamous relationships and have the participants map on their pleasure experiences to that network and assess what that looks like. Those are the ways in which we can use network analysis. Another example is in the use of taking a look at this as a sociocultural context, right? So this diagram is from a paper that I published with one of my former students, Julie Laszlo, and we looked at what are the factors necessary to maintain sexual desire in long-term relationships. How do you maintain desire in long-term relationships? And we did a systematic review of all of the studies that had been done, and we categorized those into these individual factors, these interpersonal factors, and then these societal factors. And those things are all about context, right? Even on that individual level, the expectations you have on a relationship, the extent to which you feel attracted to your partner, your ability to sort of cognitively focus in the context of a sexual relationship or in the context of a sexual event, all of those things play into the context within which sex is happening. And I'll talk a little more about the downstream effects of this toward the end of my presentation, but those things, if we can sort of get to know a little bit more, if we can research into what are these puzzle pieces that are involved in coming together to contribute to a sexual event, well, when there are problems with that sexual event, or when we have particularly pleasurable sexual events, understanding those are really helpful for educating people, providing therapy that is helping people, and having all of that be really evidence-based. Additionally, the policy implications of having these types of data can be really powerful in the downstream. So then there's also dyadic sorts of relationships, right? Like the extent to which you are satisfied in your relationship. A lot of my research has looked at the role of sexual and relationship satisfaction in sexual desire in particular, but also in other constructs, such as engaging in infidelity. A study that Dr. Janssen and I collaborated on earlier on in my career looked into what are all of these interpersonal factors that might be playing a role in whether or not someone decides to engage in infidelity or not. And then the societal factors, these like gendered expectations, the power struggle that might exist within the context of relationships, perhaps based on sex or gender, any sorts of restrictive sexual attitudes that might play in here. So these are all contexts that are measurable and that matter for a sexual relationship. Additionally, we have complex statistical models like this one, and this particular model came from testing the link between satisfaction and relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction, and how does sexual and non-sexual communication play a role not only for one member of a couple, but for both members of the couple. So we can simultaneously assess and draw conclusions from, if we collect data from both members of a couple, we can understand a lot more about the context of what's going on in their relationship. And that has really interesting implications for therapeutic care, for education, and in some cases, also for policy work. Additionally, when we think about sex education, it's so important to know the context within which that's happening. Next week, I'm about to lead a study abroad program in the Netherlands. I bring students from Minnesota to the Netherlands, and we learn about that context. The Netherlands, the Dutch context for delivering and engaging in sex education is much different from the US context within which I work and where my students work. So giving them that totally different context is such an important component of their learning. If we were to go to another area of the world, we would see another completely different context within which to understand the sex education. And we can measure that with sex science. We can group things in the context of, in this example, with this diagram, we see we've got schools. Within each individual school, you might have a different model of sex education being delivered. And then underneath that, you might have two different teachers that are teaching the content very differently. We know that all of you out there know, like, the extent to which you're comfortable talking about sex is such an important predictor of whether sex education is effective. If one of those teachers is really comfortable and the other isn't, you're going to see really different results for your students. And we can measure that with these models, which is really interesting and exciting. Another way that sex education plays out in our sex science and how we can measure this and how context is so important was depicted in a study that I published with a couple of my colleagues who I saw a couple of you are on here in 2021. And we looked at it to be able to understand how to integrate sexual pleasure into comprehensive sexuality education. And with WAS's declaration of sexual pleasure, this became really important of, like, what are the tangible ways in which we can integrate sexual pleasure into this work? And all of these components require understanding of the context, right? Relationship context, traditional risk reduction models. What is the context within which risk reduction is being delivered? Sexual empowerment. How do we empower people? Consent, sexual diversity, and sexual rights. A country level sexual rights model of looking at sexual rights from that broad context can be so important for the delivery of sex education, for people's overall sexual health, right? Additionally, in understanding sexual function, context really matters. This is Basson's model of sexual function, and you can see that there's a lot of context going on in this model to understand how sexual desire in particular, and also the sort of like how we can look at sexual response in a way that goes beyond that Masters and Janssen model and goes toward things like how there's multiple external incentives for initiating or agreeing to sex, or that people get a variety of sexual rewards and a variety of non-sexual rewards associated with their sexual experience. So understanding that context is so important. Additionally, recently, our colleagues Van Anders, Herbenek, Brado, Lori, I saw that you were on the call, so hello. They released a paper that highlighted the heteronormativity theory of low sexual desire in women who are partnered with men, where they articulated the extent to which heteronormative gender inequities are really contributing factors to low desire, and that these inequitable divisions of things like household labor or blurring the mother and partner role or objectification of women and gender norms, all of those things are so contextual and are playing such an important role in the impact that sexual desire might have in the context of a relationship. So these contextual factors are varied and also measurable, and sex science is working to measure those things and to really provide data so that we have an evidence-based approach to engage in our work. So this sexual health in context, it can be conveyed, it can be measured, and it can be tested in sex science. And this also provides us with really applied, tangible findings that are quite useful for applying in our educational work, for applying in any of the policy and advocacy work that's going on around the world, and also in therapeutic intervention. I use this stuff all the time when I'm seeing clients, and being able to pull upon those data is really powerful for people to hear about and to learn from. So thank you so much. And I will pass this on to Dr. Humphreys.
That's wonderful, Kristen. Thank you very much. So much of the work that I do is directly related to context. It's all about context in the sexual consent field. So that's a wonderful segue actually into some of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But yes, I am Terry Humphreys. I am a full prof in the Trent University Psychology Department up here in Canada, Ontario, Canada, and certainly one of the vice chairs of the Scientific Committee for WAS. And when I muse about challenges that sexual scientists face, there's a lot of different rabbit holes, obviously, we can go down, but I'm going to address some of the methodological challenges in the social side of sex research. It isn't going to be systematic in any way, but I'm going to start with some broad commentary about methodological issues and then focus on a couple of examples in my own research area to provide a little more context. So really at the macro level, and I have no slides, so you're going to just have to listen to me. At really the macro level, the culture and the legal context in which we conduct our research places kind of the first boundary or limitation around what we can say about the results that we find. That is the major context at that macro level. Social norms where we live in combination with the laws in the home countries play a huge role in shaping our understandings of what's right and wrong for the people who live in those contexts. Second thing is, who are the participants who actually sign up for the studies that we conduct? Ethics requires them to be volunteers. So volunteers for sexual studies, as we know, differ and deviate in a number of ways from the general population or the larger population we're trying to relate them to. Demographically, they're different. Socially, they're different. Politically, they typically are different from the general population. So both the representativeness of samples, the generalizability of findings are always challenging. National data sets are very hard to come by unless you live in a very progressive country. And even some of us, in progressive countries like Canada still don't have really good quality national data on a number of sexuality variables. The psychology field, as well as the sexuality field more specifically, have both been criticized for their over-reliance on what's called weird samples, WEIRD, which is, white, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic types of samples. Even a study published in 2022 in JSR suggested that even gender diverse samples are heavily underrepresented in sex research. Because most of our findings, though, come from these types of samples in the social field, should we be using these findings to drive our policy changes, our recommendations for policy changes, our legal challenges, and our social programming? Those are big questions. Third, even the interview mode that we use to ask our questions as sex researchers, be it in using an individual lab-based experiment, interviews, focus groups, telephone surveys, anonymous internet-based surveys, or if you're lucky, automated computer-assisted self-interviewing, all of which have pluses and minuses in terms of their expense, their depth of information that can be gained from them, the literacy skills that are necessary, the external validity possible, even level of participant reporting bias can differ based on the chosen method. So choosing a method in which to ask specific questions is an important consideration in the sciences. And the last global thing I want to talk about is kind of terminology issues. It's only really been in the past 20 years or so that this sexuality field has started realizing that we had to become a lot more complex and nuanced in the ways in which we ask questions about past sexual experiences. This is a conceptual problem in the research. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the now classic study of Sanders and Reinisch in 1999 that simply asked university students, whether there was a list of sexual behaviors and whether or not they thought that they constituted having had sex. Which of those behaviors refers to constituting having had sex? And the results led to kind of a revolution in how sexuality researchers asked questions about past sexual behavior. Before, we all thought we knew when a participant said that they had had sex, what that meant, or how many sex partners they had had. This study suggested we do not actually know that, and it led to a lot of questioning about the past research that had been conducted on this simple but ambiguous language use. Since that study, there's been at least 12, a dozen or more papers that have supported it and expanded on it to indicate there's a number of variables that actually influence whether an individual specifically thinks that a behavior constitutes having had sex, including the gender of the observer, the gender of the participant, whether this person is receiving or giving the behavior, whether their behavior results in an orgasm, and for whom. So just to name a few things. Again, why is all this important? Well, it kind of comes back to the research perspective or the idea of garbage in, garbage out, right? If the questions we're asking have multiple meanings for our participants, then we can't be sure how to interpret those results. So let me shift gears a little bit to a few examples of conceptual and methodological difficulties within my own field of sexual consent. There does seem to be a pretty big divide between the attitudes that we gather around consent now and the behaviors that we ask about. Studying attitudes on anything remotely political or politicized tends to lead to very pro-social attitudes. We tend to have, if we're asking in a survey, for example, on a Likert scale, we tend to have ceiling effects on these attitudes. They're all pro. So are our samples simply echoing back to us as researchers what they have been told by the society in general is appropriate? For example, sexual consent is a topic like this. It exploded on the research field because of what was happening in the general Western society at the time. A number of high-profile sexual assault, sexual harassment cases hit what Malcolm Gladwell would refer to as a tipping point in the culture, and it led to a global Me Too movement. That led many researchers to shift their focus from sexual assault more generally to the narrow topic of sexual consent as the next key nexus. Most every college and university campus now in North America and in the West now provides some sort of campaign, training, Frosh Week orientations, all on sexual consent. So there is this saturation of this information on campuses. It makes it very hard to actually differentiate students' own personal beliefs about it from what they've been told about it. We get now, when we ask about their attitudes, we get attitudes that are so positive that it's almost unbelievable. You would think that there shouldn't be a sexual violence crisis at all in North America if these are their attitudes. But obviously that's not the case. So something is going on here. And attitudes are likely highly influenced by social desirability. The need to look good or to appear normal or appropriate to others is influencing this. This comes right back to some of the cultural gendered expectations that Kristen talked about as well in her discussion. The second point that I want to raise is really a conceptual discussion, and that has been raised in the research about the distinction between wanting a behavior, sexual behavior, and consenting to one. In an effort to define sexual consent to be a researchable concept, it's important to distinguish it from related topics, related concepts like want or desire. So consenting to a behavior is different from wanting it. That makes intuitive sense. Want and desire can be seen as an emotion, a feeling, while consent can be seen as a cognitive thought or a decision that a person makes. As an example, I can consent to do the dishes in my relationship or take out the trash in my relationship, but I don't desire to do those things. I don't want to do those things, but I will consent to do them to make peace with the relationship and do my part. Why do we consent to things then in our relationships that we don't want to do? Well, there's tons of reasons why. There's lots of papers out there about why we engage in things that we don't necessarily want. Can we apply the same logic to sex? Well, can we consent to sex that we don't necessarily want in the moment? Yes. Can we desire sex that we would never consent to? Yes. Again, many reasons for this. But Peterson and Molenhart, actually in 2007, actually talked about the importance of this distinction. It needs to be drawn between want and consent. And why I raise this? Well, it's important because most of the sexual violence literature in the field, both the research and the education around it, has confounded the two terms for the most part. They see them as interchangeable, synonymous with each other. Even the laws in many countries, around the world confuse the terms by asking victims of sexual violence or harassment how much they wanted, instead of asking the correct question, which in my mind is whether sexual consent was clearly communicated. My own research has demonstrated that students can distinguish between these two concepts. It's not all that hard to do. But if you mix them with in different directions, so consent is present, but want is not, or vice versa, they get quickly confused about the appropriateness of the sexual behavior involved. What's the relevance to sexual science here? Well, it again demonstrates how important it is to clearly articulate the meaning of the terminology that we're using in our measurement tools. I'm grappling with a similar concept, sexual agency. I have a graduate student who was working on a master's thesis focused on sexual agency, and it's one of those kind of imprecise concepts that's been described as made up of a number of other behaviors, like being sexually assertive, having a high sexual self-concept, engaging in good sexual communication. Sexual agency is typically measured simply by adding up all of these things, adding up the positives, the higher the assertiveness, the self-concept and the communication, the more sexual agentic you are. However, you can also reason that the individual who, in the face of certain physical violence, decides that their best course of action is actually to submit in that moment, can also be seen as highly agentic, highly sexually agentic. They've made the best decision in the context, in circumstances. So it's not necessarily the outcome that we should be measuring in terms of agency, but the decision-making process. And that runs counter to the way in which agency is currently measured. But that is a quandary right now we're working on in the lab. So I'm trying to sum up here a little bit. Why do I raise all of these conceptual difficulties in the sexual field, and what does it have to do with WAS? Well, quality research that avoids these pitfalls that I've been describing leads to the most accurate results, which hopefully then leads to the most informed understanding of human sexual behavior that ultimately leads to better social policy, more humane laws, enables us to fund our social programming in the most efficient ways, in effective ways, and leads to improvements in sexual health, education, sexual rights, and sexual pleasure, which basically is WAS's core mission. So I will leave it at that. And we can move into our Q&A session. And while I'm looking up some of the Q&A and trying to summarize them for us, why don't I start with a question that I had thought of myself, just a general question about what kind of advice would you give to new sexual scientists entering the field? Maybe you can gnaw on that one for a while, and I'll look up these questions that have been asked of us.
You're asking us?
Yes, I'm asking you.
Kristen.
Well, I would say, I think mentorship is so important in getting involved in sex science, and in finding someone who is, willing to mentor you through. I mean, there are a lot of components to sex science that can be difficult to navigate if you feel like you're sort of totally on your own, or not feeling like you have a mentor in research. And so, especially given the contentious nature of some of the topics that we study, and how it can be really difficult to navigate. So having strong mentorship is a piece of advice, and getting involved in societies that we have, many of which are affiliates, if not all of which are affiliates of WAS. That would be a really good first step. Also getting involved in conferences. So to plug Turkey again, like submitting starting with a poster presentation or an oral presentation with your work, and seeing how it's received. Those types of opportunities can be really great. But yeah, Eric.
Fully agree. Be part of a community. It's definitely a field of research where many people work at a university, not necessarily in the team, all by themselves, and it can be hard. So community, make sure that you go for where your passion lies. It is very easy to get on a trajectory where you may where you may make decisions to do this because it's there, it's available, but you may stray from your original passion and the questions that drive you. If the question is specifically about career and research, it's not easy, and it depends also. Here, context is also very important. I'm currently in Belgium, and there are not tons of opportunities, so you have to make your way. You have to try. You have to create a community, mentors. Go for questions you're really interested in, and hope for the best. I saw a question about funding, Mike Miner. Nice that you're here as well. Funding is a big part of it. There are a lot of topics that do not deserve or that do not get the kind of attention from a research perspective that they deserve. There's so many. I saw something about dark desires of kink, and NIH is probably a little less interested in that than it perhaps should be. And so there are a lot of research studies being done on shoestring budgets and that deserve a stronger, more funding. Another example, it makes me think of research on oral contraceptives and side effects, where people have for many years tried to do more research, and it's very hard to get funding for it. Funding is unfortunately a part of our world. It's great when you get it, but it may not always be easy to get money for all topics that we should consider important. So that's kind of going into that question. What do you think yourself, Terry?
Well, on the funding point, I
No,
noticed
on the entering the field.
on entering the field. I'm long in the tooth now. Entering the field. I mean, I would concur with the mentoring issues in Canada. Here, it's very similar. There's not a lot of sexuality-based centers in colleges and universities, or whole departments. What you will find is one or two individuals who you're lucky if you have a colleague in your own department who actually also wants to study sexuality issues. So there's that necessity to kind of weave your way and find the person you want to work with. I always recommend to graduate students that they need to find the person they want to work with and just seek them out, ask them questions, and find out whether or not they're taking on graduate students, for example, because it's a long haul. As you said, it's a difficult road, and there's going to be multiple years spent, under the supervision of one other person. You got to get along with that person. You got to want to do the work, and you got to get along with that person. So there's two aspects to that, and you need to know ahead of time what you're getting into, because PhD is a long, 5, 6, 7 years, maybe more. So you certainly want to get in there, and you want to know their mentoring style as well. I always tell my students how I run my lab and how I will mentor them to give them the heads up before they make the decision, and to make sure that I let them know that yes, there is a community out there, though, and every couple times a year you'll be able to connect at a conference with like-minded individuals, and that's your opportunity to again seek out others that are doing the same research. So those are a few things that I like to highlight as well. Let's see. So there was what do you think about the tendency? What about the tendency to publish or perish that may provoke unethical conduct and many bad scientific practices? How does this influence sexual science? What are the implications to researchers and knowledge? That's a good question. Wow. Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, it's a very good question, Katja. Nice that you're here as well. And it's a problem, but it's of course something that goes way beyond sex science. The pressures on researchers, on scientists, on faculty members to publish in order to get tenure, I don't personally see as a positive development. I don't know how to best approach this. Is it a problem in our field? It probably is to some degree, and it suppresses it. It's not very conducive this kind of culture to high quality research because you see phenomena like salami slicing, where people have data sets and they publish 20 papers on it, and they don't even write in the articles that this is already been used in 19 other papers. That's a part of this culture as well. There was a paper in Science on Nature about how really sort of groundbreaking research publications are becoming less and less in terms of proportion to people who publish just sort of incremental work. So that there's a risk of fraud and publishing of data that are not reliable, of course, but we all have to keep our eyes open for those kind of things. And I don't see that part as a structural problem within our field, but the pressure of publishing, when you think of it, Masters and Janssen basically had like 2 major publications. They probably wouldn't even get tenure now. Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues, the same thing. They took their time to come up with something. The world has changed in that respect.
I've answered a couple of questions in the I've written out answers to a couple of the questions because I just am seeing the time and we're not going to get to them all. So I'm trying to answer a few of them just by typing them out. But lots of really great questions here. But I think you can see my answers there. Yeah.
There's a comment more than a question here that I think we would probably all agree to, that sexuality needs to be approached in a more inter or even transdisciplinary perspective. That's why this person talks about sexology. In this way, different disciplines can collaborate or come together. Different situations or problems can arise, and science will be more informed in that way.
Well, given the limited time we have left, I think I see here a somewhat connected question about what's the role of WAS in all of this. So part of why we wanted to do what we're doing today is to emphasize that WAS is taking science very seriously. It is, but science is complex. We're trying to facilitate science and science communication also through the conference. And so please all come, present your work, take part in all those discussions, bring your questions and your discussions to Turkey in November. And I'm very happy to see so many comments and questions, which unfortunately we won't be able to get to all today, but it means you have a lot to bring up and discuss. So come to Turkey. And WAS is trying to facilitate that science communication, also the presentation. We don't fund research. We try to use it as much as possible in the development of declarations and policies.
Well, that's a great segue to end our time together. Thank you everyone for participating in our free webinar, and we look forward to the next one. Kristen, do you want to make a pitch for the next one that's coming up?
Sure. Our next one, I don't have this information in front of me right now, but the next one is on sex education across the world. And so it will take place in July, and specifically on July 18th, 1 hour later than this one. So at 12 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 1 hour later from wherever you are. And that will be on sex education. And we'll be hearing from our sex education steering committee for WAS and from different areas of the world, updates on what's going on.
Excellent. So we'll look forward to that. Thank you all.